a few words about HS, who's here with us tonight. He started off, to begin with, working for Life magazine, where he worked for 5 years before moving on to the Associated Press, where he worked as a foreign correspondent in Beijing, Los Angeles, New Delhi, Seoul, and Moscow. In 1990, he was named Best Spot Photographer by AP, and in 1992, he was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for spot news photography for the reportage of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he is the latest author of this book here, China Portrait of a Country, which you can buy tonight if you so wish, and HS will be signing copies as well afterwards. So do have a look at it. I do recommend it highly. It's a very good book and some very illuminating things inside. There are some seats down at the front if you want to sit down as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to HS, who's going to tell you more about his work, more about the book, and a photography presentation, and we'll also have a Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Are we mic'd here? I would like to keep my remark as short as possible, and photographers should show the pictures and not speak too much. But just coming this morning, coming back by train from Bradford, some friends and a contributor of this book, whom I like to acknowledge, Karen Smith, sitting back there, who has written a fabulous essay on Chinese photography for this book. The other contributor, James King, unfortunately cannot be with us this evening. He's actually at the moment launching a magazine in Beijing, so he's back there now. We were saying that in 1978, or sometime around then, people, journalists, visitors, come into China for 1 week, would go home and write an article. And they stay in China for a month. They'll go and write a book. And those who have courage and stay long enough for a year would then stop, wouldn't say anything or wouldn't write anything. Sometime I'm reminded a Chinese writer whose name is Liu Heung Shing. He said something very interesting. Liu Xing is a writer that the Chinese communists forever try to get him on their side. Liu Xing has studied in Japan, and he once wrote that when I'm in Japan, I read foreigners' book, meaning Westerners' book. I feel so inspired that I wanted to do something with my life. He said every time I read Chinese book authored by Chinese, he always made me think and think. And when I think some more, and I think I better not do anything. Of course, we are today far past that age. I think in a way it's sort of a paradox, how much China has opened up. We rarely have someone who come to China and stay a month and write a book. Some of the recent books that I like to bring to your attention, written by people who actually quite committed to China and stayed there for a long time. And many of them, we work together on various things. In one of the book called What Does China Think, just published, an author by a British foreign policy specialist, Mark Landed. He painted the pictures of China today, that China consumes, China first produced half the world's, manufacture half the world's shoes and clothes. At the same time, China consume 40% of the world's cement and coal. And China also consumes 30% of the world's production of steel, as well as 12% of the energy. At the same time, today China is so integrated into the world's economy that it manages to double the world's cost of petrol. While doing that, at the same time, China also half the cost of the computers we use today. Another writer who writes for Washington Post, Philip Pan, described China in his book Out of Mao's Shadow. He profiled many of these people who suffered under Mao. But in the book, he described that for the Chinese people, the last 25 years is perhaps the best time of our last 5,000 years. Yet, on the other hand, another writer and a colleague, John Pomfret, has a different take on China. He feels that China is actually mired in big problem of four problems. One is that we have a dire demographic disaster, meaning Chinese are aging very, very fast. We're going to age before China becomes rich. Second problem is that he feels that China has an overrated economy, and China also has an environment that is under siege. And lastly, he feels Chinese have an ideology that doesn't travel well. According to the IMF, China is poised to surpass the United States in terms of GDP by 2025. Yet, because China has 1.3 billion people, so by per capita basis, China is not a dragon as it is feared. China instead, according to Pomfret, it is a mid-sized lizard, because the economy basically ranks 109th place in the world between Switzerland and Morocco in Africa. China seems to attract a lot of criticisms, especially on human rights and Tibet. And in one of the most recent column by Nicholas Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times after the Olympic, he described how journalism, and that is his take on journalism about China. He describes it, we described China, we described the planes that crash and never those that land. For me, I wanted to explain a little bit about some of the background that I set out to do this book. I've been involved in China for a long, long time. I was born to a mainland parents in Hong Kong in 1951, and they sent me back as a primary student to the mainland because for some reason they thought in early 1950s that perhaps in China I could get a better education. But it was little did I know that when I was in a primary school student, I quickly was confounded by the reality how the ideology and communism divide people into boxes or pigeonhole people into peasants, workers, and soldiers. And my parents didn't fit any one of those, so I was cast aside as undesirable. I remember the time that I used to try to make up for having parents who are peaceful landlords weren't soldiers and peasants, I took part in this so-called Fall Anti-Pest campaign. So try to make up my shortcoming of not being born to a peasant parents. I will hit as many flies as possible every Wednesday and collect them on the matchbox. And I hand the matchbox to my teacher, who would grade every one of us on our report card. You have a political behavior sort of grades. And my grades is always C. So they never want to give me a scarf as a young pioneer. But so I take part in the Great Leap Forward in 1958 as a toddler. And I saw the first effects of the famine that eventually resulted with 30 million deaths, according to Jasper Baker's book. I saw even in my neighbor when my parents' home was being appropriated by the state, so other families moving into our house, and I saw everybody had a swollen face, swollen legs, and so on. So my father took me back to Hong Kong in 1960. By the time of 1966, I was only a 15-year-old teenager. I came back to the mainland to visit relatives, and I saw the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. So I went back to Hong Kong, went to New York for my university study in 1970. When I came back to China, again, that was in 1976. I apprenticed in Life magazine, but I came back for my first assignment for Time magazine in 1976, for which I never reached my destination of Beijing, because it was all travel to Beijing was all closed. I photographed the people in the streets of Guangzhou by the banks of Pearl River Delta. I noticed something, with my experience, I noticed something that is rather odd. Instead of seeing the people greatly saddened by the death of Mao, I just noticed in people's body language that the Chinese people will actually show a sign of relief rather than grief. And the next time I did go back to China again, that's when Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping decided to normalize the diplomatic relations. I went back in 1978 to prepare for the Bureau of Time magazine, and on January 1st, I was the first accredited photojournalist for Time. And 2 years later, I joined the Associated Press and stayed 2 more years before I was transferred to Los Angeles, and then on to India, Seoul, and then the former Soviet Union. While I was in South Korea in May 1989, I saw the students went on hunger strike in Beijing, and I volunteered to go. And when I left at the end of June 9, 1989, I was following the students with a gunshot wound to the hospital. And then I went on to my reportings and saw the collapse of the Soviet Union from the 90 to 94. And since 97, I have moved back to Beijing, and now our home is a little place in the Chinese Hutong in Beijing. Next year is going to be the 60th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. As someone in my position, because of experience at various stages of my life and my work, somehow there is this mixture of, on the one hand, being an outsider and as well as being an insider, culturally speaking. I have participated in many book projects. I always feel very frustrated. There are many books published internationally, as well as those books published by the Chinese in the mainland. I somehow find it wasn't a China that I recognized. By that I mean, when we do a book on China internationally, either it's in United States or in Great Britain or France or Germany, our society seems to be very specialized. We have groups of people. They are sinologists. They study the culture. They study the language, and the history, and so on. And they're very knowledgeable about China. Whereas when the book comes to photography, we have a situation. We have photo editors who are very versatile with the visual language, but not necessarily familiar with the history and the society as such. And they're also, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that researching for photographs and images from China is a daunting task, because most people would find the only sources you go to is the state-owned Xinhua news agency. So there's a lot of difficulty one face in order to do a photography book on China. And the other side is we are faced with a different set of problems. In China, somehow the photographers were, I'm speaking about in the 50s and 60s and 70s, up until early 80s. In China, journalists are picked, are selected to join the press first according to your credentials, meaning going back to what I just described, are you from the families of peasants, workers, and soldiers? Unless you are from these three groups, somehow the communists will find you are less than reliable to be given the rights to report and so on. So most of the photographers I know, somehow there are quite few women. You will see later. Mao's first personal photographer, Madame Hou Bo, is a lady. Madame Xiao Zhuan from Nanjing, whose work you will see later, she's also a lady. She joined the Eight Roads Army as a 16-year-old and then learned photography. But by and large, a lot of photographers were men. And the Chinese idea that being a man, especially if you demobilize from the army as a soldier, you are strong enough to carry a camera and a tripod. So they are politically reliable, and they are going to be the photographers. So, but somehow they still see, as Mao says, since 1942, in this Yan'an very important conference, where Mao dictate and as well as declare that photography, journalism, arts, and literature are to be explicitly made as a tool of the Communist Party. And therefore, photography is used to reinforce what was, for example, in art, socialist realism has already pervaded, and photography is to reinforce that. And given these circumstances, is not very strange to see when the Chinese decided to put a book together. They don't show a China that is either objectively true or described lives that I think I was familiar with. So compounded by this the dilemma and my feeling wanted to share with readers, of this 60 years of People's Republic of China, I set out about 4 or 5 years ago when China was awarded the Olympic bid to host the Beijing Olympic that just finished. At that time, I thought, with all these people coming to Beijing, and would they or would they not understand the journey the Chinese people have traveled to arrive at this central position of the world today? Because what you see is Rem Koolhaas building, Norman Foster's airport in Beijing. Would they not understand what happened in the first 30 years in China would have such a direct effect on the China in the second 30 years, to the point that today Chinese are rightly or wrongly criticized being totally materialistic. They seem to be single-mindedly focused in building this economy. I think partly was that in China there is also a Chinese version of never again. And that never again basically came from the first 30, 35 years of experience. So when my book came out, my first book on China came out at that time in 82, published by Penguin, is titled China After Mao. I asked a researcher at the Chinese Academy of Social Science, I said, please count for me how many political campaigns the Chinese have gone through in a matter of 25 years, from 1949 to 82. And he counted and finally said, well, 23 campaigns, which means the Chinese people were subjected to a political campaign little over every year. They have a political campaign. So when we look at the photography later, some of these early images, they're pure propaganda pictures. And there were some reviewers asked me why there was those pictures. The only explanation I could give is that unless you have that closeness or the experience of living in China, then it's very difficult to appreciate and to understand how politics has sort of seeped under everybody's skin. Because Mao once says, is politics in command. That it means everything in daily lives, go to the school, the neighborhood committee, everybody is being under watch by one form of organization or others. So I wanted to, in this book, after 4 years of editing and looking at all these innumerable images, and during this period, three of the photographers already passed. It gives me the sense of urgency that if I don't do this book now, 4 years and 5 years from now, and many of the photographers, older photographers were already in 88, 93, 96. In a few years, they would all leave us. And what would happen to their negatives? And because they would not, their children may not be interested in photography, they would not give this to the state-owned Xinhua news agency, which has already put an official lock, and they're not releasing any pictures after, of the Cultural Revolution, of a number of the subjects. So I think this would be, this loss would be very, very tragic. Second of all, while editing this book, many of the young university students who intern with me would ask me, who is Liu Shaoqi? Who is this one? To me, it was very, very baffling because I know of no British student would ask their parents who is Winston Churchill. But to the Chinese, to this young generation, would ask me who is Liu Shaoqi, I thought that was rather shocking, and that brings me back to the last point, and that is when the Chinese officials, when they travel in front of the foreigners, for lack of better words, or embarrassed, they oftentimes talk about how China has a very proud tradition of 3,000 years continuing civilizations and culture. I thought at the same time when China lectured Japan for forgetting the history, that the Chinese people, we at least should recognize what happened the last 60 years. And it is this I like to leave you, and I want to show you the images from this book. And I hope after this, if you have any question, I'll be happy to have an exchange. I don't know how to operate this, actually. Sorry. Just bear with me a second. Goodness. Great. I try to put this video together, hoping we can bring you back to some of the signs of the different decades. Unfortunately, with the photographs, I hope you get a chance to get the caption and understand some of what happened behind those images. For example, some of the, there's a particular moving images when I like is all these men and women on their knees with a placard that says, you know, please protect the environment because we need to live and survive. So some of these the story behind the images, I hope you have a chance and find them in the caption. And doing this book, I'm very, very grateful to Tashin have the vision to do these books together, because throughout this process, the publisher has some idea. One of which is we try to search for 200 quotes to add some voices to this photograph, and that's when I said I come across some of the things said by Chinese writer like Liu Xing. One of the quote they didn't put in the book was one I find by the French President Charles de Gaulle, who said, "Oh, China is a very large country with lots of people." So that didn't make the book, unfortunately. So if you have any comment and any question, I'll be happy to at this time to try to answer your questions.
Let's start at the back here.
Yeah, terrific photographs, by the way. You mentioned that the state photographs from the Cultural Revolution had been locked away. Do you mean they're locked away, or we've lost them?
I said being locked away. There is now a widely known internal party document which prohibits the agency from releasing these photographs, because you can Xinhua news agency has a service that resell these news images for publishing and so on. But for the period of the Cultural Revolution and of course 1989, it's just been just no. Anybody wants to use the images of that period needs a signature of the head of Xinhua, who is a ministerial rank official. So this is the work by 88 Chinese photographer, China seen by the Chinese photographer, and all this material is very, I get them from the photographer themselves, and it takes time to scan them and make sure the quality is consistent throughout the books. And I'm very, very grateful that they give me their trust.
Great photographs.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, a lot of the photographers who took the photos at the time, those were, either very official-looking photos or for propaganda purposes. How do those photographers view those particular photos nowadays?
There are a few photographers. If you recall, there is an image of showing two Chinese were in the dungeon, in the jet plane position, being denounced during one of these public rally. His name is Mr. Jiang Shaowu, and he's a chief photographer of the Liaoning daily in the northeast of China, and he's in his 80s. He's a Communist Party member. He still feels that these pictures would make China look very bad. So it took a lot of persuasion and a lot of visits to him for him to share this for the use in the book by showing other examples and so on. Some of the idea how I know you all familiar with these great photographs by Marc Ribot. He done some work in China, Cartier-Bresson, and Franklin Stewart. All this, a lot of photographers come to China. We try to portray daily lives. We try to find, the littlest details and try to capture them. But somehow, I think the way Chinese sees photography, at least in the early period, they see it as, the way I understand it is that they see it as an extension of the Chinese ink painting. They see it as photography is best used to do portraits, to do landscape, how they seek the harmony of man and the nature and so on. They do not particularly see photography, the role it can play as a tool for photojournalism. And because photography has in their mind a certain function, so they do not necessarily use photography. For example, many people ask me, 30 million people vanished during the Great Famine. Where are those images? And I look very, very hard. And the Chinese, when they see this situation, they find it's deeply humiliating. They just don't pick up the camera and record them. I'm sure some exist, but I just find it very, very difficult to find them. And that goes back to the issue. I think a New York writer, Susan Sontag, comment on photography. She said it quite well, because photograph is only a fragment. The moral and the aesthetic weights of the photograph depends on where you insert it. And so some of these images at the time, I'm sure when they were working for the official party newspaper or magazine, when they recorded, they were simply doing their job. But when we look at it now, the significance and the power it conveys, I think it surpassed anything that they imagined in the original moment.
I'm just wondering, there were a lot of images of the Mao's Little Red Book in this, and I'm wondering, do you know who actually wrote it?
Who wrote it?
Yeah.
Well, that book arguably sells even more than Bible, I think. It was full of quotation from Mao's writing and his speech, and then they become a little quote, and the Little Red Book is full of his quote. And one of the photographs, if you recall, there are some swimmers. Everyone has a red book. At the time, during the Cultural Revolution, the things went so ridiculous that those were the army, the Navy people. So the Navy people cannot imagine that when they're on the ship or on the gunboats, that what if the water gets wet, the book gets wet. So the Navy have waterproof mild quotation printed actually on plastic sheet, so that the book, it floats in the water, but it doesn't get spoiled.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask about sort of integration. A lot of the pictures all the pictures pretty much are about China as a country, and you mentioned the relevance of the book in terms of the Olympics and the 30 or 60 years about the Cultural Revolution. And obviously, we're more aware of China now. China's blamed for the increase in oil price and all these sort of things. So I'm wondering, from a Chinese perspective, what relevance photography has in terms of helping integrate China or helping make people in the West, such as us, aware of China and its role in the, in the world economy, and whether the Chinese government have any opinion on the use of photography in helping to promote China positively, or helping to integrate China or make people more aware about China in today's society.
To answer your question, I'd like to mention two things. The first is that never before than today that China has as many universities that has newly set up a Department of Communication or Department of Journalism and photojournalism. So the education part has improved dramatically. And I remember the days in Tiananmen Square. You have many photo stand. Tourists go there, you get a pictures, and they, wherever you are from China, you will get your little, photographs back. But today, camera, those photography stands all disappear because everybody has cameras today. I think the last figure is that China has nearly 500 million subscribers of mobile phones, and each has a camera. I'm actually coming back to London in November to be on the jury for Sony Ericsson, because last year they had the winners from China. So the education part, the availability of cameras and the computers and all, and the software, and also it just unprecedented. It's explosive. On the other hand, I think we talked about the economy, the material progress that China managed to achieve. But I think that media remains to be the one last area of reform. I have given talks of this 2 times now in China, and went okay. In fact, Prime Minister Zhou Wen Jiabao's photographer came to my talk. So they seem to be okay with it. And the book has been reviewed by the national newspapers in China. Of course, they didn't talk about these pictures. They just talk about the book, about the person. But somehow the photography, one of the pictures that you see of the gunshot wounded students on the flatback was being, on the rickshaw. That photograph was taken by me. And in a recent article in the newspaper, just before the Olympic, they interviewed me for the newspaper. It's a major newspaper in Beijing. And I provided them a few photographs, but their images, nowhere in China, I didn't provide it to them. But somehow it became a national incident, because when they make up the page before they go to press, the interview went on for 3 pages. The photograph they took, and the photograph I provide, and so on. But the photo editor find, after they make up the newspaper, there is a hole in the 3 pages. They don't know what to do. So a photography editor who was born in 1980 went on the web and put down my name, and they find this photograph and put it down. He didn't know it was 1989. June 4th was the most sensitive topic in China. But I suspect there was something more. There was a kind of issues between, because that newspaper is co-owned by a southern media group and a northern media group, and they have problems with them, I think. And 2 years ago, the editor-in-chief was sacked. And the 2 years previous than that, another was sacked. So this newspaper was known to be troublemaker, quote unquote. So this man, born in 1980, had no idea what happened in 1989 because he was only 8, 9 years old. So he pulled down this picture and put it in, and then, because I know the Chinese newspaper went through a series of censorship every day before the papers goes printed, but somehow this newspaper slipped through and was printed, and the next day I was on the plane going to the south. Phones are ringing off the hook. Say, what happened to you? Are you still there? Are you okay? The pictures, it was on a website. The paper was called back from the newsstand. Are you okay? And so on and so forth. I say, wait a minute, I haven't seen it yet. Let me see the picture, then I'll comment. I mentioned it just to make the point, and that is that somehow the leaders feel, media is not something you want to tinker with. They still want to have a very, very monolithic, singular voice in China in order, to try to maintain that stability. Because without stability, somehow they feel economy cannot continue plow ahead, 8, 9, 10%, 11% a year. So would China open up and liberalize? I believe so, because I believe more and more Chinese educated, in this country, in America, they come back. They are now working in the newspaper. They assume important managerial position in enterprises. They understand that in order for China to grow, to go to the next phase, we need media. Because what media does is that it provides a certain platform so that a civilized debate can take place, And by the way, the recent earthquake in Sichuan was something very significant, because I took part in the World Press Photo master class about 10 years ago. I gave a class there, and I took a book as big as this book, published by the China News Agency, about the flood. In 1996, 95, 96, hundreds of thousands of people died in different regions of the flood. And the entire book that I brought to show the students at the master class was about People's Liberation Army carrying the sandbags. And I remember at the time talking to the Chinese propaganda officials. I said, first of all, Communist Party did not produce the flood. It's the act of God. Earthquake, flood, it happens. But somehow they feel, in order to portray this, they could only show you the pictures of the army with a sandbag. By not describing the scale of the fatality or the damages, in fact, nobody knows that Communist Party actually did an okay job to save life, to put economy back, and so on and so forth. So they have a book as thick as this with PLA carrying sandbag from every possible angles. So 10 years later, just before the Olympic, Sichuan get wiped out. And now you see images coming out and so on. In fact, they were very surprised that the world is very sympathetic to China, that their lives are safe, and in a manner of speed that this rescue operation took place. So that the Chinese media, I think they are aware of this. And the way I like to describe often to my friends to describe China is that China is like a mandarin duck. If you look at a mandarin duck above the water, it's calm, it's very steady, but under the water, the duck is pedaling as fast as possible. And in the size of China and with over 1 billion people, somehow they feel media is something that they want to tinker the least. At least it is still true as we speak. But how far they will change, I think for the last 25 years, the world has seen the pragmatic side of the Chinese.
There was a change during the earthquake coverage, wasn't there?
Dramatic change. Yeah, that's what I meant. They begin to go to the other. They understand this transparency, this publicity didn't do any damage. So these are the things they, as Deng Xiaoping said, crossing the river by filling the stones. In my view, that's how China changed. China doesn't change very easily if you take out the clubs and just and force the change, unfortunately. But I think the public opinion matters a lot. I mean, to the extent that the amount of money that China spent to stage this Olympic game is mind-boggling, which means they do care about the world, the public opinion, how China is being perceived, etc., etc.
Okay, lady with a question here.
Good evening.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you about one particular photograph. It was the one with the old man holding a bowl eating, and the circumstance seems quite a poor kind of environment. And then above him there is this shelf, and on the shelf there is the portrait of Mao. And I guess I was wondering in that picture, what did you think that meant, that the portrait was there? How important was it for the old man eating his meal?
Actually, it's interesting, that question. I took that photographs when in 1980, 79-80, I went to Sichuan province, and in Sichuan there is this very beautiful mountain called Mount Emei, O-M-E-I, and the mountain is about maybe 1,500 meter to 2,000 meter high, and so I climb with my camera gears, and you pass through the villages, and you pass through, just on the way up. And then I saw, and this village, and I stopped, and I saw this man eating. And maybe you didn't notice, on the other side of that image, there's also a vertical banner slogan. It says, "Listen to Chairman Hua." And Hua is the man that Mao handed the power to Hua Guofeng. That image is, frankly speaking, he didn't know why the picture was there either. I try to portray how, that picture of Mao is buried in the pile of shoes. But the peasant was going on his daily life, eating his bowl of rice, and somehow this is a very, very common sight. But somehow when you put everything in the one frame, it it shows the impact of politics in daily life.
Okay, are there any final questions? Let's go here, and then I'd like to ask one.
Hi, good evening. What would you say the impact of internet is on modern day average China life from a media perspective?
Is huge. I think they're now, the last figure I read, there are more internet users in China now than in the US. And the internet also has become sort of the second media in a way that it opens up a lot of blogs and the chat rooms and so on and so forth. And it is extremely lively. The government seems to be interested in monitoring some of the major websites, like Sina.com, Sohu.com. These are the major news portal in China, and some of the main ones. They monitor very, very carefully. But then there's a lot of other websites today. For example, when the German magazine Der Spiegel reviewed my book, immediately somebody pulled down the Der Spiegel, the photo gallery, and drop it on their website. The speed that it was done was astonishing. And we all know the effect of internet worldwide. I think it is particularly impactful when you count the number of people in China using internet.
I've got time for one more question. I think I'll ask the final question. I'm bringing it back to 2008. I was interested, you talked about the Olympics and how the fact that China had put on such a big deal and spent so much money showed that they really cared what the outside world thought. I was just interested yourself as a photographer and the editor of this book and looking at the 60 years. There was the huge opening ceremony, which was full of imagery and various different things. As a photographer, what were your impressions of that? I mean, do you think, and the Olympics as a whole, did it give out the right kind of message for yourself, having looked at all these photographs over the 60 years?
Well, I personally, I was not at the ceremony, opening ceremony. It took, because you have to get a lottery ticket to get in there. I heard the British ambassador over dinner, he said in order for him to get his friends to get into the opening ceremony, he actually used the British travel agents to buy the ticket for the opening ceremony. And people who get the ticket have to queue up 5 hours before that. And I think it's just not an exercise I want to go through. I personally thought, Zhang Yimou, the Chinese film director who was the artistic director for the opening ceremony, I thought he was being, I think he's not very familiar with the world outside of China. I think he is being very literal interpretation of four great inventions of China: the paper, the printing, and how to create a harmonious society, all that stuff. What I really like to comment actually is the contrast of the Chinese opening ceremony and the closing ceremony, and then the British came with 8 minutes. They have 8 minutes in the closing ceremony to take the Olympic flag away from the Chinese. I thought it was funny that British, we have British audience here. There is this long imperial history that the British people do not feel they need to make a statement. They just come, get on the double-deck bus, they sing a song, and they take the flag and they go. Whereas Chinese make such a big fuss. I remember on that day of the closing ceremony, I watched a little bit of Chinese television, and I saw David Beckham was interviewed by this very ponderous Chinese anchor person. Said, "Well, don't you have to go and rehearse for the closing ceremony? Blah 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 blah." And David Beckham said, he said, "Oh yeah, I will go." But then he on the second thought, he said, "What is there to rehearse? I just go and kick the ball." So that funny you should ask that question. I think that is so emblematic about how China sees the world and how China wants to be perceived. To the extent, we finally, by the time the game's over, the residents of Beijing get so fed up. They're just 7 years of talking about it. They just get so fed up of it. But on the other hand, for I have to say, for China and for the Chinese people, maybe after spending at least, only the official figure is $50 billion US. It may buy the Chinese something intangible, and that is finally they have acquired a sense of self-confidence, and from here on, they could truly, be a member of the world, and they do not have to go through all this fuss again. That's my take of it.
Okay, we will take one final question just here before we wrap up.
Mr. Liu, I was deeply touched and moved by the photographs, and especially as many of those were taken in the belief that they were representing normal life in those days, and now they are shocking. My question was, I cannot even begin to imagine what it was like to live through those years, but perhaps it is more important that the Chinese understand them than that we do. My question is whether you have actually made a selection that presents more of plane crashes rather than planes landing nicely. That's one question. And then another is when you talk about the 3,000 years of uninterrupted civilization in China, and you also mentioned something else, that the Chinese have a way of saying never again. Now, Mao was not the first absolute ruler and dictator in the history of China. What is it that you believe this book will help the future generations understand? What is it that should never happen again? Because if it happens, it won't be like Mao. It will be something different.
Right. That's why I earlier I mentioned I hope when you get a chance to also see the explanation of the photographs. I think I try to through the daily life, try to capture both those planes that didn't land as well as those land, including, how, especially after Mao, normality resumed, young lovers go to the park, when the Chinese rockets going up, all those things. I think you will see, I try to examine this journey people took. And your second question is that, I think there's a general truth that if and Chinese, in particular, we seem to go to history to find the role model, as well as try to draw lessons. Until the day that ordinary students and people recognize this is what happened in the 60 years, then it would be even harder still to talk about media reform, isn't it? If you don't even recognize some of these very, very monumental events that took place in the 60 years. So I think what I like to, I'm particularly interested and keen that, that next year maybe the Chinese language edition would come out. But so far, the few presentation I make in China, people are very, very interested in it. And that's, I hope, what the book would do. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that brings us nicely to the end there. Thank you very much, HS.